Welcome aboard, mates. You've just stepped back onto the deck of the Pirate Therapist, where the storms are emotional, the treasure is healing, and every scar has a story. So out here, no feeling is too much, no past is too messy. We sail through the fog of anxiety, the dark waters of depression, and the hidden coves of trauma. We use stories, folklore in this episode, and a bit of pirate mischief just to chart a new course for the sake of our mental health. On this ship, you're not broken cargo, you're part of the crew. So together we'll dive for buried narratives that shaped you and haul them back up into the light and decide which ones still deserve a place in your captain's log. So grab a mug of something warm and secure the rigging, settle yourself in. I am Lee Perry. I am the Pirate Therapist. This is where we learn that the roughest seas can make the strongest sailors. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about folklore. We're going to start with the story of Persephone. Her husband is Hades, and her mother is Demeter, the goddess of grain and agriculture. She was the provider of the harvest. She was one of the original 12 gods on Mount Olympus, and she was the sister of Zeus and Hades, among others. But after a tryst with Zeus, Demeter gave birth to Persephone. Persephone, born of two gods, was therefore immortal and by all accounts very beautiful. Like her mother, who was the goddess of grain and agriculture, she shared in all the same symbols and presentations as her mother before her abduction. She possessed very little that differentiated her from her mother besides her exceptional beauty. Her beauty caught the eye of Hades, who was her uncle and god of the underworld. He fell in love with her from afar, and Hades asked her father, Zeus, for her hand in marriage. And despite being a questionable father, he consented. And even though he knew that Demeter would not acquiesce, she would not be okay with marrying her daughter to Hades. So Hades decided to abduct Persephone. He rose from the underworld unannounced and carried Persephone off in his chariot to live with him underground. Now, Demeter was distraught, and she searched the earth for her lost daughter, sometimes in the guise of an old woman. When eventually she learned of her daughter's fate, Demeter was distraught. She was very upset, to say the least. Demeter is known for her wrath, and she brings to mind the phrase, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." Now, this idiom was coined in 1697 by playwright William Congreve, specifically referring to a woman rejected romantically, but it seems apt for Demeter, whose heart was crushed by a god from hell. The saying conjures up visions of an overly emotional woman who is unconsolable in her rage. And perhaps back in ancient Greece, such displays of rage and anger were more palatable than they are today, as Demeter was a popular god to whom temples were devoted. Moreover, Demeter's sense of powerlessness against the abduction of her daughter would have resonated with many of the mothers of ancient Greece whose daughters were married off at a young age at the determination of their fathers. There are many stories of Demeter's fury which were meted out whilst on her travels looking for her daughter. One such story sees her turn a man into a gecko for making fun of her whilst she was in the form of an old woman. At the peak of her frustration, she induced a great famine by refusing to tend to the earth. This made Zeus beg her to end the famine, but she only relented once Zeus agreed to intercede for the release of Persephone. While Demeter was busy scouring the face of the earth and unleashing her anger on unsuspecting victims, we can only imagine that Persephone is what she's feeling after she was abducted. The stories do not talk about Persephone's point of view. Zeus finally sends Hermes to the underworld to demand Hades release his unwilling bride, and here we pick up on Persephone's situation via her husband. Hades is reluctant to return Persephone and tricks her into staying by using pomegranate seeds. In some tellings, he places the kernel in Persephone's mouth, knowing its divine taste will compel her to return to him. In other versions, he persuades Persephone to eat, thereby condemning her to remain in the underworld forevermore. And while the exact reasoning behind this is unclear, what is clear is that after agreeing to let Persephone go, Hades performs some last-minute trickery involving a pomegranate that prevents Persephone from leaving. Finally, after some negotiations, a compromise is reached whereby Hades will let Persephone go to her mother on the condition that she will return to him for half the year, depending on who you ask. When Demeter and her daughter are reunited, the earth again flourishes with vegetation, except for the few months of the year when Persephone is returned to the underworld and winter begins to reign again on the earth. Now, the story of Persephone is widely understood as an origin story to explain the existence of seasons and perennial change from life to death back to life. However, the story is more about Demeter than Persephone. Demeter plays the role of Mother Earth, and this is what her name signifies. Further, her defiance against the almighty Zeus makes Demeter a powerful and appealing maternal figure who is prepared to fight for her child. She tends to the life of the planet as well as the fate of her own children. Persephone spends part of each year in the underworld with Hades because she ate the pomegranate seeds there, which binds her to return below for several months. When her time in the underworld is over, she rises back to her mother, and Demeter's joy restores fertility to the land, brimming with warmth and growth and abundance, until Persephone must descend again to the underworld. Now, in terms of seasonal depression, do you see how the story of Persephone can help explain this in a way that makes sense both in regards to the seasons, but also in regards to mental health in the winter months when depression is higher and people struggle more? Stories give people language and metaphors for what they're going through, and this can lead to better coping and a stronger sense of self. Persephone's time in the underworld can stand for depressive episodes, maybe trauma or burnout, and while her return symbolizes the opposite, recovery and hope and reconnection with life. The cyclical image of Persephone can help people to understand that emotional lows can be followed by growth rather than viewing suffering as a permanent failure. A more modern story that shares this idea or this message would be Annie. Orphan Annie. It's an orphan girl who maintains a positive attitude in spite of her difficult circumstances. And she even sings a song about tomorrow and how the sun will come out tomorrow. So imagine this. Imagine someone sitting across from a therapist staring at the floor. I feel like this is it, they say. This dark place is who I am now. I'm broken. I don't see a way out. I might then tell the story of Persephone. I talk about a girl taken into the underworld, far from warmth and light. At first, there is only shock and grief. The world above seems lost, and to them, the underworld feels endless. Days blur, time stretches, and it goes on for seeming eternity. Persephone can't leave, yet she is still a character in the story. She's not an object in a dark room. The story keeps moving even when she feels stuck. As the tale unfolds, I will not say, "You are Persephone," but I might gently ask, is this part of their life? Is it like Persephone's descent? If so, what would your underworld look like? Together we'd give it shape. The heaviness in the body, the numb mornings, the quiet fear that is this going to be forever? The darkness stops being vague. It stops being a terrifying fog and becomes a place with a name. It's a landscape that we can walk through rather than a place where we have to sit and endure. Now, it's not, I am the darkness, but I am in the underworld. Then we look at what Persephone still has. She cannot choose to leave, but she can choose how she moves down there. She can notice the small patches of color in the shadows, the people she meets, the rituals she creates to mark each day. She can talk to Hermes when he arrives, accept Demeter's love that reaches even down in the underworld. And I might ask, who are the Hermes like figures in your life? Is it people? Maybe behaviors that help you or get you through when things feel the darkest. Slowly, the person in the chair begins to find the names of friends, maybe a song, maybe a behavior or a weekly ritual that helps us feel more balanced. None of these erase the underworld, but they are lanterns. These are choices. The story continues. Persephone does not stay below forever. There is a turning, a bargain, a path, a route to climb. When she does return to the world above, spring follows, not because everything is perfect, but because something in her life is moving again. The winter still comes, but the winters are no longer endless. They're just seasons. Now, I might say, if this is your winter, what might your spring look like? Not a fantasy, but what small signs show that the ground is thawing? This person imagines a future chapter, getting out of bed a bit earlier or finding it easier to laugh once in a while. And maybe just, and I hope this might be true, they might feel safe enough to reach out instead of hiding. instead of isolating. They are still in their underworld. Nothing magical has erased it, but now their pain is part of a journey, not a dead end. They're not a broken thing. They are a protagonist in a story that just happens to be in a hard chapter. This is what stories like Persephone's can do. They give shape to chaos. They show us that the descent can be followed by ascent. They remind us that even in the darkest places, there are choices to make. There are allies to find, and our future chapters and pages are still unwritten. Storytelling can reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety, even PTSD, by allowing people to process emotions and reframe experiences. In a quiet bedroom lit only by a small lamp, a notebook lies on a nightstand. For weeks, maybe months, its owner has been too heavy with sadness and worry to touch it. Thoughts feel tangled and loud, spinning in circles. What's wrong with me? Why can't I move on? Why does that memory keep cycling and recycling in my head? One night they pick up a pen, not to be creative or to do the therapy thing right, but just to get a little space from the noise and the repetition of these thoughts in their head. The first sentence comes out clumsy. Today was hard. Then another. I woke up exhausted and couldn't stop thinking about that day. The pen keeps moving. The story of that day begins to spill out what was said, what was done, and what it felt like inside their body. As the words land on the page, the memory becomes something with edges. It is no longer formless dread that's just flooding their chest. It's a sequence. This happened, then this, then this. They can see that there was a before and an after. There were people involved, choices made about things that were out of their control. And for the first time in a long time, the experience exists somewhere outside of their own head, where they can look at it instead of just drowning in it. The next evening, they read what they wrote. This time they noticed the smaller details, how they apologized for everything, how they felt responsible for something that was clearly not their fault, how their younger self did the best they could with what they knew at that time. Then a tiny shift happened. The story began to change from I am weak and broken to I went through something overwhelming and I survived it. The facts haven't changed, but the meaning has started to soften. The perspective is altering. Days later, sitting in a support group, they share a piece of their story out loud. They were anxious at first. As they speak, they watch the people nod, some with tears in their eyes, some with expressions of deep recognition. For so long, the story has been a private nightmare, a secret that felt like proof of their brokenness. Now, spoken into a circle of witnesses, it takes on another identity, something human, something that others can understand. After they finish, someone across the room said, "That sounds a lot like what happened to me." Another added, "When I had panic attacks after my accident, I thought I was going crazy too." Suddenly, the storyteller was not alone inside of their narrative. It's moved from this horrible thing that proves I'm not normal to this painful thing that many others have also faced. That change, seeing their expression as part of a shared human pattern, that quietly loosens the grip of shame. In therapy, they brought up the same story. This time, I listened carefully and then asked the questions gently. If we broke this into chapters, what would each chapter be called? Together, we'd name them. Chapter 1, Before I Knew. Chapter 2, The Day Everything Changed. Chapter 3, Numbness. Chapter 4, Trying to Pretend I'm Fine. Each chapter gets explored. Where did the fear live in the body? What did your younger self need in that time? What beliefs got planted that day, like I'm not safe or I don't matter? And are those beliefs actually true now? As the story is told and retold in different ways, whether it's on the page or aloud in group or in a therapy office, the person begins to notice new angles. They get a different perspective. They see things by understanding different angles of the story. They see the moments of strength that they never recognized, the way they protected a sibling, the way that they kept showing up to work in spite of their panic, the way they reached for help even when they felt embarrassed. These details become new sentences in the narrative. I froze, but I also. I was terrified, but I still. And the story shifts again from pure helplessness to a mix of pain and courage. Some nights the anxiety still flares. It may be a sound or a smell that can yank them right back into that old panic. But now, instead of thinking I'm back there again, they have practiced saying, "This is my nervous system remembering. I'm here now." That line comes from the story that they've worked on, reframing flashbacks, not as proof of permanent damage, but as normal reactions that can be soothed. The terror is still intense. It still has a name and a context, which makes it a little less overpowering because of that name and context. Over months, the act of telling your story becomes a kind of rhythm. Sometimes it's written, a letter to the younger self, or maybe it's a journal entry. Sometimes it's spoken to a therapist or even a memo app. Maybe you want to be one of those that go to an open mic night and just tell your story, of struggle and survival. Each version is slightly different, emphasizing new pieces to be processed, the fear and the loss and the anger, but more and more it becomes resilience and hope. With each telling, the story moves a bit farther from being an uncontrollable storm and a bit closer to being a map. The person can trace where their depression deepens and where their anxiety spikes, where their echoes of trauma are the loudest, and they can also see what things help, be it a friend who stayed or a coping skill that worked, or, and I love this one, a boundary that you finally set with people. This map doesn't erase the pain, but it helps you navigate it. They no longer feel completely blindsided by their own emotions. One day they read back through the old pages and they notice something surprising. Early entries are full of words like always and never and broken. And recent ones may hold more phrases like right now and sometimes and learning. The outer circumstances may not have changed dramatically, but the inner language has. The story is no longer a verdict, it's a journey. The depression and anxiety, even the lingering trauma responses still show up, but they're only chapters. They're not the title of the book. And this is what storytelling can do, whether written in a private notebook or spoken in a safe room, or even if you just speak it out loud into a recorder. You can take the experiences that one once felt like endless pain and give them shape and sequence. It feels witnessed and less lonely, chipping away at the shame and isolation, discovering new meanings and strengths that have been woven into their past by reshaping "I am ruined" into "I am living through something hard and I continue to move." The events themselves do not vanish. The past does not change, but the story around those events becomes more kind. The new narrative, symptoms can soften, fear becomes smaller, and a small but real sense of choice and forward motion can return. One sentence, one telling at a time. For you, hearing other stories might normalize your experience and offer new coping strategies, which can be deeply validating. Another story. On Tuesday evening, a small group gathers in a community center room that smells faintly of tea or coffee or soda and dust. The chairs are in a circle. No one is quite sure where to look first. A woman in her 20s breaks the silence. "In my family," she says, "we always tell the story of my great grandmother who came to this country with nothing but a suitcase and a baby. Anytime life gets hard, my mom says, 'Remember where you came from.'" As she talks, others lean in. They have never met her great grandmother, but the picture becomes clear. A young woman on a bus, gripping a child in a single bag, heart pounding with anxiety, moving towards a country that doesn't even know her name. The story is not just about survival, it's about feeling that people like us keep going, even when the road is rough. Another voice speaks up. "In my tribe, we have a story about how the world was sung into being," he says. "We grew up hearing that words and songs have power and that we can heal or harm with those words." He explains how when he became depressed, he stopped singing. His grandmother noticed. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" she asked, "Where did your song go?" That question and the story behind it reminded him that he is part of a people who believe that voices matter. Slowly, he began to sing again, not because the sadness disappeared, but because he remembered that his voice was important and it had a home. Around the room, more stories emerge. A father talks about a bedtime tale that his own dad used to tell about a small village where everyone shows up with a dish when someone is sick. He realized years later that it was his family's quiet way of saying, We will not suffer alone here. A recent immigrant shared a childhood legend about a river that remembers every name that is spoken on its banks. And when she felt invisible in her new country, she would picture that river and think, at least somewhere, my name is still known. Now, none of these stories fix anyone's problem on the spot. The bills are still coming due. The grief is still heavy and real. The diagnoses don't vanish, but as each person talks, something subtle shifts. Instead of this is just me broken by myself, the feeling becomes this is us. And there are other people who carry similar stories. The room itself starts to feel like a living story, a place where different cultures and families are woven together. The tales about grandmothers and rivers and border crossings and songs and villages, these become threads in a shared tapestry. People begin to recognize pieces of themselves in each other's words. One woman who has been quiet finally speaks. I always thought that I did not have a culture, she said. We moved a lot. We didn't have many traditions. But listening to you all, I realized that my culture might be the stories my mom told about making a new home everywhere we landed. Maybe that's our thing, starting over. People in the group nodded. In that moment, she isn't just a person who doesn't belong anywhere. She's the daughter of a woman who knew how to plant roots in new soil again and again. That realization doesn't erase her loneliness, but it gives it context. She belongs to a line of people who know how to adapt. By the end of the evening, nobody has received a miracle cure, but what they have received is something quieter, the sense that they are part of a larger we. They all carry different languages and foods and rituals, but the act of telling and listening to stories turns the room into a small village. Each person's pain is no longer a private or nameless burden. It's a chapter in a larger human story that includes ancestors, communities, and shared values. Walking out into the night, some of them realize that they feel a little less like strangers in their own lives. They have heard and they have been heard. They have remembered where they come from, and for the moment, that memory, the sense of community and culture and belonging carried in their stories makes the world feel more bearable, more connected. Folk tales and myths often teach moral values and empathy. They teach problem solving. This supports a children's cognitive and emotional development. In a small classroom at the edge of town, a heater hums and rain taps softly against the windows. A group of kids sits cross-legged on a rug, faces turned towards an elderly man who has just opened a worn story book. Tonight, the old man says, I'm going to tell you about the turtle and the fire. The children quiet down and lean in. Already their minds are doing quiet work. They're trying to guess what a turtle could possibly have to do with fire. Their brains are preparing to learn, but no one calls it a lesson. This is just story time. The tale begins with a village that has lost its fire. The nights are cold, the people are frightened, and they're snapping at one another. In the story, a group of animals gather to solve this problem. The big, fast animals argue loudly about who is strongest and who should lead. The turtle, who is small and slow, just listened. As the old man speaks, a boy in the front row, who is often told he is too slow, starts to identify with the turtle and pays special attention to that character. He notices that the turtle thinks before speaking. When the larger animals rush off and fail, the turtle suggests a different path and a longer route, but it's safer, using the river's reflection to see the mountain where the fire still burns. While the children track the plot, something quiet is happening inside of them. They are learning problem solving, the idea that when the obvious solution fails, a new perspective can help. They see that thinking carefully, noticing details, and choosing a different path, that these are valuable skills. No one stands up and says, this is our executive function, or this is flexible thinking, but their brains practice it anyway. Later in the story, the turtle shares the fire, making sure each animal carries a small ember back to the village. One greedy animal, the fox, tries to hoard the flame and ends up getting burned. The old man doesn't need to preach. The story shows its own consequences. The children feel a twinge in their chests when the greedy fox gets hurt and the others suffer. That twinge is empathy beginning to stretch, imagining what it feels like to be someone who made a bad choice and is now feeling alone. The girl in the back, who has been fighting with her classmates, may feel the heat in her face as she hears how the greedy fox sat in the dark, clutching his ember, afraid to ask for help. She knows that feeling. She wanted everything her way, but in the end, she ended up lonely. The story doesn't accuse her directly, but it offers a mirror, and she can see herself without being shamed by name. When the turtle forgives the fox and shows him how to share the fire safely, another layer of learning slips in. The children can see that mistakes don't have to be the end of the story. There can be recovery with growth and change. Their idea of good and bad shifts from fixed labels to actions and consequences. The moral development in motion, understanding why certain choices help the community and others cause harm. As the tale continued, the orator pauses at key moments. What could the turtle do now? Why do you think the fox is angry? How do you think the little bird feels when nobody listens to her idea? The kids offer answers, some silly and some on point. In trying to imagine what each character thinks and feels, they are practicing theory of mind, the cognitive skill of stepping into another's perspective. They are learning that people and animals can feel scared and act tough, or feel guilty and act angry. Every guess exercises the muscles of empathy and emotional understanding. When the story ends, the village is again warm. The animals sit together around the fire that they helped bring home. The elderly man closes the book and looks around the room. What did you notice about the turtle? One child shouted, "He didn't give up." Another jumped in with, "He was slow but smart." And the quiet child added, "He shared a fire, even with the greedy fox." The children have just summarized resilience, patience, cooperation, and forgiveness. These are big ideas about how to live with others. They did it by talking about animals, which feels safe. No one had to admit, "I'm jealous" or "I'm afraid that people won't share with me," but those feelings were gently touched and named through the story. Weeks later on the playground, two kids argue over a ball, and shouts arise. One of them stops and says, "You're being greedy like the fox." They both laugh, a little embarrassed, but the tension cracks. They remember the turtle sharing the fire, and one suggests, "We can take turns." The story has slipped into their real life problem solving, giving them shared language for conflict and fairness. In that way, folk tales and myths are more than entertainment. They are a safe rehearsal space where children can try on different roles in their minds, whether it's the hero, helper, trickster, or outsider. They can practice seeing from different perspectives. They get to watch complicated emotions play out without being overwhelmed by their own. They get to safely experiment with solutions to problems, from sharing that courage to asking for help. Over time, these repeated story journeys build inner maps. Children can identify with the animals in the story. When I'm scared, I can be brave like the little bird. When I mess up, I can apologize like the greedy fox. Or being small and quiet doesn't mean I'm useless. I might see something others miss, like the turtle. Sitting on that classroom rug, the children may forget the exact words of the tale, but they carry the patterns with them. The sense that problems can be faced, feelings can be understood, and the way we treat others matter. Their minds grow sharper and more flexible, and under the gentle disguise of a simple story about animals in search of fire. What stories did you grow up with that helped you make sense of sadness and grief or fear? Can you remember a story? Doesn't matter if it's religious, cultural, or just family. Can you remember a story that made you feel less alone? Now, as this voyage comes to an end, it's time to bring the ship into harbor. If today's tale of folklore and mental health stirred something in you, remember, feeling a lot doesn't make you weak. It just means you're human and very much alive. The stories you carry, from childhood myths to family legends, have shaped how you see yourself, your pain, and your power, but they're not the final map. You're allowed to question them. You should. Rewrite them, create new ones that honor both your struggle and your strength. If you're sailing through rough waters right now, anxiety and depression or grief or trauma, reach out to a trusted friend or go talk to a therapist or call a local support line. You don't have to captain your ship alone. Thank you for climbing aboard with me. I am the pirate therapist. So until next time, keep your heart open, your crew close, and your stories honest. May you find calm seas, calm companions, and a narrative that lets you belong exactly as you are.